Hey everyone, welcome back to HT Reddit Reads, and today's topic is going to be Redditors who work at cemeteries and graveyards. What strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? Let's get into it. In the cemetery mausoleum chapel, where I occasionally play the organ for funerals, vandals had broken in the night before the service. They smashed several crypt covers, probably with sledgehammers, exposing the remains of those that had been entombed therein. It was an eerie atmosphere to hold a funeral service that morning with such desecration in plain sight. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did my yard work, mowing, weed whacking, flower beds, etc. Outside from occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out not to be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually quite a peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down for about 4 to 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and closed her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and shit. It's fucking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of people inside. Plus, when you hop down in there, you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. We had a late afternoon service once that ran into the evening. It was October, so the sun went down early while I was filling in the grave afterwards. Conveniently, none of the lights on the loader tractor worked for some reason. No blown fuses or loose wires or anything, the lights just didn't work. Next day when I reported the issue, we went over to the same tractor and the lights worked perfectly fine, and they worked fine for the rest of the time I worked there. I worked in the cemetery over the summer during college. One morning I was mowing the grounds and discovered the body of a cat which had been bound and set on fire. People fucking suck sometimes. Most of the time. All the time? Nah, people are okay sometimes. My great-great-grandfather and his son were foremen at the cemetery in my hometown. Of course, way before I was ever around. The older of them was said to be sensitive, as in he felt and saw things. And there are stories of people that he buried that came by during nights to tell him that they were cold, which means that there were no flowers/wreaths on the grave, or that their feet were cold. The soil around where the foot of the casket was had leveled. He was also said to be able to see people in what we refer to as hemphero, skin journey, as in the body shows itself to tell someone that the soul has departed. One particular story about that they still tell around the Sunday dinner table is when a friend of his had been lost at sea. Nobody knew, of course, until much later, but my 2XG grandfather saw his friend entering the house drenched in seawater and noisily walk into the living room and sit himself on an old sailor's chair that was by the door, and just as soon the man disappears. My great-grandfather took over his father's job when he got too old to do it. I can't remember any similar stories about him, but there's a joke about some youngster that tried to scare him that people have told all over the country. Probably an imported joke. There were a few people in the town that didn't like the fact that the graveyard workers worked after dark, and there were a group of young men that decided that enough was enough. They were going to scare the gravedigger. So they outfitted themselves with white sheets and went to the graveyard and walked around the graveyard saying all sorts of ghostly sounds like boo. And they found the gravedigger as he was in the middle of digging a grave by hand, and he stood around the grave for what seemed like hours, shouting and screaming and doing whatever it is ghosts do. The gravedigger paid them no mind and just continued with his work. The young men then, having given up, started to leave, and as they approached the gate of the graveyard, they could hear shouting and protesting behind them, as the gravedigger angrily came running towards them, shouting, "It's one thing that you are up and about walking around here, but don't you think for a second that I'll allow you to leave." I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard, had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, Except on closer examination, all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, but a bit eerie until you get used to it. You'll learn to treat anything recognizable as a human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you're putting there. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception/office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed in nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of New Jersey, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in the beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate, and there was no one there. We looked at the video footage of the entrance, and you could see us, the office manager, and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside the gate. There were multiple cameras, and not a single one picked up on anyone on the other side of the gate, and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. A lady in my hometown would walk her 2 Irish wolfhounds through one of my local cemeteries. It sure was freaky to see as a kid, before I knew dogs were as large as wolfhounds could exist. Other kids also saw them from time to time, and there was a local legend about these two massive wolf-like specters wandering through. The rumors were sometimes out of control, and people said the demon dogs could appear and vanish at will, had red eyes, etc. I don't work in a cemetery, but I did go clean one up with my family. We cut down weeds, planted flowers, etc. So anyways, I was wiping off graves when I see 3 graves side by side, and they didn't have the same last name. So I asked my mom if they were related, and she said no, but a woman was married to them, and they had all gotten into accidents within 2 years of being married to her. She buried them side by side, and when she passed away, she requested to be buried in the cemetery 2 counties away. It's strange because the first grave, the man died in 1984, the second died in 1986, and the third died in 1988. They were all very wealthy and owned their own business, and when they died, she closed the businesses. I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees, and would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and re-establish their cemetery. Soon after I started working there, we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some of the trees for easier access to his field. It turned out that the oldest cemetery in the county, dating back to the 1700s, after investigating some of the names on the headstones, it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery was there, a schoolhouse stood there. The teachers were a husband and wife. It's not clear on what exactly happened, but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kind of made it sound like an illness of some kind, and that they were all quarantined in the school until they all died. After that, the school was demolished, and the students and husband and wife were all buried where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. I work security for a nursery for trees and plants, and when they changed owners before my time, the new owners found that the old owners had dug up parts of a graveyard. Broken headstones were just piled up next to the still standing ones, and so the company puzzled the headstones back together and set them in the concrete. All that setup is to tell you that I would be patrolling in a vehicle, and I would go past the cemetery, and there would be this coyote and an owl just hanging out in the middle of the graveyard looking at me. This happened pretty regularly. TLDR, an owl and a coyote would just stare at me from a graveyard. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents lived out in the middle of nowhere pretty much, and it's surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told, they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket, and they all looked really old. one of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out of the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones, but still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. Thank you for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing. It'll be greatly appreciated. I'll be posting Monday through Friday, and if you want to visit the original threads, I'll link them in the description. And that's it. See ya.